Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Boal, and I'm a Senior Research Associate in WestEd's Justice and Prevention Research Center. And I'm happy to be here today to discuss online sexual exploitation of children offender types, including where they converge and how they can be used. Before I start, though, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the team that supported the development of this presentation. I truly appreciate all of your work to make this possible. So thanks to everyone on this list. So with that, I'll go ahead and give you a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to what I mean by technology-facilitated sexual exploitation of children. I'll then give an overview of available typologies to help build understanding of the characteristics of offenders of these types of crimes. After this overview, I'll describe where these typologies converge and how they differ, and I'll conclude by highlighting why these typologies are useful to law enforcement, as well as their limitations. So I'd like to start by grounding everyone in what I mean by technology-facilitated exploitation of children. Defining terms in this area can be difficult. Individuals from research, law enforcement, and legal backgrounds utilize varied terms, and even within these groups, there's a large degree of variation in how terms are used and defined. This variation creates challenges in conducting research on these crimes in a systematic way. For example, it can make it harder to document the frequency of these crimes and compare crimes across countries or jurisdictions when definitions vary. With this caveat in mind, I'll share how we conceptualize technology-facilitated sexual exploitation of children to guide our examination of offender typology. Our working definition is inclusive of online sexual solicitation of children, which includes asking children to engage in sexual activities or talk. It includes technology-facilitated sex trafficking, such as using the internet to assist with the recruitment or soliciting of a child for a commercial sex act. And it includes the production and distribution of child exploitative materials. This definition may be helpful to keep in mind as we think about the volume of these crimes and the types of offenders who commit these crimes. We know that technology-facilitated sexual exploitation of children is a large and a global issue. For example, since 1998, when the cyber tip line for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, was created in the United States, they have received more than 74 million reports of potential child exploitation, including abusive images of children, online enticement, child sex trafficking, and child sexual molestation. In 2019 alone, the cyber tip line received more than 16.9 million reports. The constantly evolving and anonymous nature of the internet allows offenders to engage in these crimes from locations all over the world, creating challenges for law enforcement as they try to navigate how to identify victims and apprehend offenders in this global and cross-jurisdictional context. Given the pervasive nature of this issue, researchers have attempted to develop typologies to better understand offender strategies and their motivations. Although the details of these typologies vary, they share the ultimate goal of better understanding offender strategies and motivations in order to ultimately inform decisions regarding investigation, sentencing, treatment, and supervision. So they do have the potential to be quite useful. When we go to the literature to determine what typologies should be considered to better understand offender motivations and strategies, we see that there have been numerous typologies offered to better understand these offenders, most of which emerging over the last 2 decades. So I'm going to take some time to walk you through each of these typologies briefly. The first typology was offered by Hartman and colleagues, and it was published in 1984. And this typology was not focused on online offenders. Instead, it was focused on those who collect sexually abusive images broadly, so pre-widespread use of the internet. Although it's not specific to online offenders, you will see that the 4 types identified by Hartman and colleagues share many similarities with the technology-specific typologies that appear to have set the foundation for these more specific typologies that emerge later. This typology includes 4 types that are differentiated by whether the offender collects sexually abusive images in secret without contact, collects images in conjunction with contact, shares images with others, or seeks financial gains from their collecting behaviors. The next typology was published in 2004 by Crone. This typology differentiates each type by examining the extent to which the offender networks with other offenders, the level of security utilized to prevent detection, and whether the abuse is indirect or direct. As you can see from this typology, it resulted in a large number of offender types that differ across these 3 dimensions. And the result of this typology is that it functions kind of like a trajectory of offending behaviors from least to most serious, with those who may accidentally view child exploitative materials, perhaps by responding to spam or accidentally clicking something on a website, all the way to those who have physically abused children, as well as those who produce and distribute materials of them or others abusing children. So it really shows quite the trajectory. Sullivan and Beach also published a typology in 2004 that was focused more specifically on offenders who collect abusive images rather than the entire spectrum of abusive behaviors. This typology specified 3 types that varied based on whether or not there was contact and their intent behind collecting, with some offenders collecting out of curiosity without the desire to have contact with children, and others collecting to feed their progressing interest in children and potentially having contact. Alexi and colleagues suggested yet another typology just a year later. This typology was developed using data from print and media coverage to examine characteristics of offenders. This analysis resulted in 3 types that vary based on whether offenders traffic or collect child exploitative materials online, engage in discussion with children and attempt to meet them in person, or engage in both those behaviors. In 2011, Briggs and colleagues examined internet chat room records from offender cases and developed a typology based on those records. This typology is somewhat different than some of the others that are out there because it doesn't focus on offenders broadly, but instead is focused on the subset of offenders who engage in chats with minors. So it's less about those that collect and distribute materials and more about that personal interaction with the children over chat. Based on their analysis, they specified 2 offender types, those whose goal is to make contact with children and those whose goal is to engage in explicit discussion online without ever meeting in person. Webster and colleagues also took a different approach than some other scholars in developing a typology that they introduced in 2012. Rather than looking at behavior, these researchers conducted interviews with offenders to better understand their motivations and classify their grooming behaviors. In their framework, the 3 types are differentiated based on previous sexual offending, whether or not they concealed their identity, and the extent to which they had exploitative materials of children. It also utilized information about their level of networking with other offenders to differentiate the types. The next typology that emerged was developed by Tenner and colleagues in 2015. The authors utilized law enforcement reports to develop offender types. This typology includes 4 types that differ based on their patterns of online communication, such as whether they meet the victims online or know the victims in person first, and then communication progresses to online. They also included the extent to which they conceal their identity and the relationship dynamics of the victim with the victim, such as the speed of the relationship and whether it's reciprocal. The level of sex crime expertise was also considered as a factor to differentiate these types. In 2016, Clevenger and colleagues published a study examining characteristics of offenders, which resulted in their description of 3 specific types that emerged in their data. From this research, they determined that characteristics of offenders differed among those who exclusively possessed child exploitative materials, those who attempted or committed physical contact, and those who produced or distributed child exploitative materials. The final typology in this review was offered by DeHart and colleagues in 2017. To develop their typology, the researchers examined evidence from technology-facilitated crimes against children cases and identified 4 offender types. These offenders varied based on whether they attempted or committed physical contact and whether they paid for exploitive materials or contact. So as you can see, there are a large number of typologies available, with each using different language, different criteria, and focusing on different parts of the offender population. Given this, we thought it would be helpful to unpack how these typologies converge and where they differ. In looking at the typologies, we examined the criteria used to differentiate offenders, and this led us to 8 different dimensions that we saw used within at least 2 typologies, as well as some other factors that were used in kind of one typology but not repeated elsewhere that aren't included here. So as you can see, whether or not offenders attempted or engaged in physical contact with victims was used across all typologies. This appears to be a very meaningful differentiator regarding how an offender behaves and what their kind of trajectory of offense looks like, regardless of how the typology was constructed and what offender population it was focused on. Whether or not offenders collect child exploitative materials was another common dimension within these typologies, and it was observed in 7 out of the 9. And the 2 typologies that don't differentiate based on whether the offender collects explicit materials were the typologies that were focused on internet chat records and offender motivations. So I think it seems that the lack of inclusion there is really specific to the population or kind of the orientation of the typology. Whether or not exploitive materials were shared with others and the level of networking with other offenders was included as a dimension in 4 of the 9 typologies. The frameworks that didn't utilize this dimension were those I just described, as well as those that focused more on using the internet to engage with children, for example, through chat, rather than to network with other offenders. Intent was also a dimension in 4 of the typologies. And interestingly, this dimension was utilized in nearly all of the typologies that did not include the sharing dimension. The ones that included the sharing dimension appeared to be more focused on behaviors, while the ones that included the intent dimension appeared to be more focused on motivations behind the behaviors. So that kind of helps differentiate why those factors were present in some and not so much in others. 3 typologies considered the offender's technical sophistication or their ability to hide in cyberspace or conceal their identity as a dimension to differentiate types. And this dimension actually, interestingly, went across those that could be seen as more focused on behavior, as well as those more focused on motivation or intent. Just 2 typologies included a financial aspect, including whether offenders sell exploitative materials for profit or whether they pay to receive exploitative materials or contact. And finally, 2 typologies explicitly included sex crime history as a factor for differentiating offenders. And these same 2 typologies also included a dimension about offender dynamics with their victim. This consolidation helps us understand what factors might be the most useful to differentiate offenders. Across all typologies, it appears that physical contact, whether images are collected or shared, offender intent, and ability to conceal are probably the most useful or are going to be viewed across multiple sources of literature as important. compared to some of the others that may be more specific toward a certain subgroup. So although these typologies may be helpful to consider, I do want to note that there are several limitations when we want to think about offender typologies and how to use them. First, there has been limited synthesis across typologies, which can make it difficult to know which to use in practice when different typologies offer different advice on how to think about offender groups. Second, the extent to which and type of data used to develop each typology varied widely, as did the samples. This creates a situation where a one-to-one comparison of typologies may be inappropriate without considering the context in which it was created. So really understanding, was this typology focused on internet chat versus was this focused on arrest records, and what does that mean for interpreting it? Finally, and in my perspective, most significantly, there's a lack of research testing the extent to which these typologies are actually useful. Further research in this area would help determine which typologies are most accurate and the extent to which typologies should be relied on in the field. Despite these limitations, we know that the number of cases law enforcement is tasked with often far exceeds the number they can actively investigate at any given time. To ensure resources are directed to stop the most dangerous offenders and save children in most immediate harm, the prioritization of cases becomes important. We know that cases should be prioritized when they involve production of child exploitative materials, luring of minors to meet in person, and cases with offenders with a known history of committing these types of crimes. Thus, training should emphasize strategies to investigate the most dangerous offenders, which potentially could be identified by having a solid grasp of available typologies and the characteristics to look for within these typologies. So if you remember back to earlier in this presentation, I noted that typologies can be helpful to understand offender strategies and motivations, as well as to inform investigations, sentencing, treatment, and supervision. With this in mind, the practical application of typologies might help make decisions regarding which offenders are most likely to do the most immediate harm, which offenders are likely to engage in the most harmful offenses, which investigative strategies might be most appropriate for a given offender or a given type of crime, when to push for harsher sentences, and the appropriate approach to supervision and post-release requirements. All of these decisions can be incredibly difficult to make, but are extremely important to effectively protect children. Typologies are one piece of information that may be useful in making these hard calls. So with that, I will share with you the references that were discussed in this presentation, as well as my contact information in case you have any questions after today's presentation. Thank you so much for having me.